wine friends and Trinket fans. I'm Jess, and this is Trinket Picnic, a podcast where we talk all things small, whimsical, impractical, collectible, lovable, and obsessable. And we take the deepest dives possible with, of course, plenty of side quests as we wander through the history and lore of life's little things. What's a trinket? Well, that's for you to decide, but today we are diving into the early history of the quintessential, perhaps even the ultimate trinket company. That's right, it's Sanrio time. Hello. Your Trinket auntie is finally back. And what better way to kick off this episode than with the 1977 banger, That Girl Kitty. I've had the song stuck in my head for weeks, and so you're welcome. Of course, to go along with the fabulous music, this is a picnic, so I've got some drinks and snacks at the ready as we peruse the deep history of Sanrio. So for this episode, I've actually got two drinks because there are two facets of the Sanrio story that I want to highlight right from the start. So, the first drink. This is a Hello Kitty Hi-Up soda. Hi-Up is actually a Taiwanese brand, I believe, and they are kind of known for putting licensed characters on their cans, making the cans collectible, of course. The can doesn't actually say anything about flavor, but it does say, quote, Japanese style sparkling water, end quote. But reading the ingredients, this definitely totally has sugar in it. And there is also a small reference to Japanese ramune soda. That's on the import sticker. But it's in a totally normal aluminum can, soda can. And it's not in the classic glass bottle with the marble that I normally associate with Japanese ramune. But maybe they've just added the word to kind of like mean like a generic cider flavor. I'm not sure. So that's the first drink. And my second drink is actual ramune soda. I believe this is white peach flavored, and it's from the Hatakosen company. And yes, it's got the classic glass marble inside that true ramune bottles have. Which, by the way, wait, is it like too early for a quick little side quest? And whatever. This podcast is 100% built on the power of side quests. So ramune, the Japanese carbonated soda, was actually brought to Japan by a Scottish pharmacist who was living in Kobe in the late 1800s. Yes, 1800s. He initially imported this, quote unquote, carbonated lemonade for the expat community. And it was originally sort of for a possible cholera treatment, but eventually the Japanese also got hooked, they loved it, and still do. And in fact, the ramune name comes from the English word lemonade. So lemonade, ramune, a bit similar. So why these two drinks? Well, number one, I've got to drink ramune for its nostalgia. The majority of this episode looks back on not only the history of Sanrio especially during the Showa era, but also the childhood and youth of Sanrio's founder. So I'm kind of trying to focus on the retro vibe, I guess, with the snacks. But I also have the Hello Kitty Hi-Up canned drink because, well, it's only right to pay tribute to the queen. Because as you'll see, we probably would not know about Sanrio without her, or Sanrio would not be the same company without her. So we kind of got to kick things off with a tribute. K-I-T-T-Y, K-I-T-T-Y. Everybody say Hello Kitty. Who loves flowers in the sun or a party just for one? It's Kitty, Kitty, Kitty. Who will invite her friends along? They can hear her play a song. It's Kitty, Kitty, Kitty. If you don't know where she lives, you might have missed her and her papa and her mama. And there's Minnie, she's my sister. They're a nitty-bitty, pretty kitty family. But even though they're kitties, they're like you and me. Rainy days turn sunny, funny, wait and see. Anyway, I did buy a few of the Hi-Up cans with different characters, but I picked this one for today's picnic because out of the ones at the store, it kind of felt the most classic. Hello Kitty is on the front of the can, sitting in what looks like a glass cup full of fizzy pink liquid and also ice cubes. And oh, of course, she also has one of her BFFs, Tiny Chum, who is a little bear with a bow on his head. And he also has like a Peter Pan-like collar around his neck. He's with her too. And they look like they're having a great time soaking in fizzy soda. I'll definitely post a picture of this so you can enjoy the cuteness. Anyway, all right. Although I love plain sparkling water, I don't actually drink soda, so I am a little worried about how sweet this is going to be, but let's give it a go. All right, pop it open. There we go. And, oh, wow. Okay, so it smells good. It smells like, sort of like something very familiar, like cotton candy or kind of creamy smell. Yeah, like almost like a cream soda. So, okay, let's give it a shot. Okay. Not too sweet. I mean, definitely a soda. Like, I don't think they should use the water, the word water on the can at all. It's definitely not like sparkling water, but it's not overly sweet. And yeah, it definitely tastes kind of like a cream soda, maybe not quite as sweet, and with a hint of cotton candy, which I love cotton candy. So that is a great way to kick it off. And I'm glad I don't drink soda because I might be drinking those every day. Okay. I also have a couple other snacks here, but I think I will open them in a bit and save them for later. And yes, of course, if you're new here, welcome, hola, bienvenidos, annyeong, bonjour, benvida, I don't know. Welcome to Trinket Picnic. And there you have the extent of my foreign language capacity, which is more or less no capacity. Anyway, this podcast is a bit like a wandering audio tour for the history of my favorite trinkets. It's perfect for those of you who spend hours on Wikipedia or fandom wikis and just kind of, I don't know, want to chill with an audio version that you can listen to during your commute or doing mindless chores. And well, you know, what's a little meandering without snacks? So this Hi-Up drink is a perfect way to begin our Sanrio tour. Let's get cracking. So I'm not sure if it is possible, but in case you have somehow stumbled upon a podcast about trinkets and you haven't heard of Sanrio, and I really doubt this is even possible, let's just start by saying two things. Sanrio is the Japanese company who created and owns the character Hello Kitty. Hello Kitty is the second highest grossing media franchise in the world, second only to Pokemon, which, by the way, is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. And I've definitely been thinking about brewing up a Pokemon Trinkets episode at some point. So, anyway, back to Sanrio and their icon, Hello Kitty. Needless to say, the kawaii, cute, cool girl cat created in the 1970s will definitely be a part of this podcast series. Yes, that's right. We will be spending more than one episode on Sanrio because Sanrio the company is just so much more than Hello Kitty, queen though she is. The company's origins, along with especially the early years, are interesting and honestly kind of bonkers enough to warrant their own episodes. Indeed, there is plenty to cover. There's tragedy, drama, we've got business fails, business boons. We're going to cover the effects of war, the might of Japan's soft power, arguments regarding manufactured sweetness and co-modification, and, of course, the art of becoming a truly global success. And yes, of course, we'll talk about the mountains of trinkets, as well as books and magazines and films and games that have come out of Sanrio in the last 65 years. The fascinating part? A lot of this stuff, especially the early stuff, has little connection to the Sanrio characters we know today. For instance, did you know that a Sanrio-produced film won the 1978 Academy Award for Best Feature-Length Documentary? Yes, well, I didn't, at least not before doing the research. I mean, after more than 6 decades, I think there's been over 450 characters, and of course, billions of dollars of merchandise. Yeah, that's a lot of trinkets. There is more than enough to cover in one episode. I have really learned my lesson after the last 2 episodes, which I did about Sylvanian families. By the way, please go give those a listen if you haven't already, because the history and global reach of Sylvanian families, aka calico critters, is also incredibly fascinating. I know that if we're going to truly do a deep dive, and that's what this podcast is all about after all, there's just no way that I'm going to be able to cover all of Sanrio in 2 hours, or even 4 or 6. This chronological series, and honestly, given its long history, chronologically is really the only way for me to wrap my head around the research for this series. So I will be covering every decade of Sanrio history from its founding in 1960 through to present day, with each episode basically covering one decade. Pretty much that means for me, 2026 is probably going to be the year of Sanrio, which, I'm totally fine with, because basically, when it comes down to it, this series is just my way of coping with the fact that I didn't get to experience the Sanrio's 60th anniversary exhibitions, which basically ran for 5 years. And then there was, of course, also the 50th anniversary exhibition celebrating Hello Kitty herself. Yeah, I didn't get to go to any of those. I'm not salty. I promise. I'm not salty. So it doesn't really matter, though, because this is actually a very good year to do this series, because at the end of 2026, Hello Kitty's main designer, Yuko Yamaguchi, will be retiring. In addition, in April, a new museum will open in the Yamanashi Prefecture called the Yamanashi Strawberry King Museum. And this museum is basically dedicated to Sanrio's founder, Shintaro Tsuji, and will supposedly cover a lot of early company history. Hopefully one day I will get to visit and alleviate my sad feelings about missing out on all the anniversary exhibitions. Now, I am going to channel my inner positivity here, my melody, so to speak, and we're going to dive deep into the long history of Sanrio. Let's get cracking. It's impossible to talk about the origin of Sanrio without talking about the original Strawberry King himself, Shintaro Tsuji, the founder of Sanrio. In fact, in the book called Pink Globalization, the author Christine Arellano writes that, quote, "To understand Sanrio and Hello Kitty, one must understand Shintaro Tsuji," end quote. So to understand the brand, we've got to talk about this man. And oh, right, one note before going forward. As much as possible, I'm going to stick with the Western naming convention, meaning saying the first name or proper name first, and then following that by the surname or the family name. I'm a Westerner speaking English, so I think this makes the most sense. Some of my notes may have the names written the opposite way, so forgive me if I screw one of them up, but this first one I know extremely well, Shintaro Tsuji, the founder of Sanrio, the true driving force behind this company. Tsuji was born on December 7th, 1927, which is only actually a few weeks after my grandmother. I was the caregiver for my grandmother for several years and actually remain close with her despite now living on the other side of the world. So this is probably why I have an unexplainable attachment to the 98-year-old Tsuji and to elderly people in general. So you'll have to just kind of excuse my sometimes overt admiration of him. However, as you'll soon see, I'm not the only one to fall under his spell. So, Tsuji was born into a well-established, wealthy, kind of old family in Kofu in the Yamanashi prefecture in Japan. Yamanashi is not very far away from Tokyo. It's a bit west. These days, it's super accessible via public transportation. Like within a couple of hours, you can get there from Tokyo. Mount Fuji can be seen from the mountains of the city, although most of Kofu lies in sort of a shielded mountain valley. Kofu is the capital of the prefecture and the largest city, and more than a quarter of the prefecture is protected as natural parks. And it's a super popular place for both foreign and domestic tourists, and probably because of the natural beauty, along with all of the onsens that are there, because of the amount of volcanic activity. Very, very popular. I'm just sort of trying to paint a picture for you because I think understanding the sort of idyllic setting of Tsuji's childhood is important. His grandfather was supposedly a well-known shogi player, and shogi is popular sort of basically like Japanese chess. And this same grandfather also owned a couple of very popular restaurants. Even though this grandfather died before Tsuji was even born, the business success apparently continued because Tsuji's mother was the owner and manager of 3 different roikans, which are sort of like Japanese inns. So by the time she had Tsuji, she was already owned and managing this. I mention these specific details because I want to also establish the sort of the breadth and the depth of Tsuji's family wealth, but also to kind of, I don't know, there's going to be this theme of entrepreneurial spirit. And I realized during my research that this spirit was around him from a very young age, or, it was in his family before he was even born. So you can almost say like it was in Tsuji's blood. And I think that to understand the trajectory of Sanrio, as well as the way that it gained its success over the decades, it's imperative to understand who Tsuji is and what his childhood was like. So much of our essence as adult humans is formed when we are children. I mean, innumerable studies have proved this. Basically that the reality of both good and bad experiences and the long-term effects that they have and how they shape, an individual's development. And so it's crucial for understanding how Sanrio survived those first couple of decades it was in business. We've got to understand where Tsuji came from. So he was definitely born into a life of privilege. This is basically without question. Even though Japan was in the middle of the Showa financial crisis, which was a bit of a precursor to the Great Depression, he definitely lived a life of luxury. His mother even sent him to a private Christian kindergarten. The kindergarten was founded by a Canadian Methodist missionary called, her name was Martha Cartmel. And this kindergarten was very popular with wealthy families, both Japanese and expat. From what I could find, this kindergarten operated quite differently from the Japanese kindergartens in that there was this emphasis on gift giving, both within the classroom and also out into the community, especially towards those who were living in poverty. In an interview with the Japan Times in 2008, Tsuji even said that a lot of the Japanese families didn't even know the birthdays of their children. So having these monthly birthday parties that they would do, they were extremely eye-opening and influential for him. He even said in that same interview that he was, quote, deeply moved by such events, end quote. He also said that he basically forgot everything he learned there, like as far as the religion goes, except, it's just this concept of gift giving that really made an impact. I also want to be clear. Like many Japanese during this time, he also experienced a lot of trauma, especially the kind involving death. Not much can be found as far as information about his father. He seems to have died either before Tsuji was born or before he could remember him being there. Either way, his father was gone when he was quite young. But then he has this sort of other huge event, which is the first big death, which is his mother's, when Tsuji is 13. And in that interview, Tsuji says that he believes that his mother died of leukemia. This is a huge blow to him and his life. It's like a seismic shift happened when she died. Although it doesn't seem like he was like thrust into a life of material poverty, his life was definitely turned into one of incredible emotional poverty. The extended family, or maybe it was some sort of like foster family, although I believe it was his aunt, which is who he went to live with, was basically very cold and distant toward him and kind of blamed him for a lot of things, like called him lazy, asked him why he was eating so much food, really laid on sort of the guilt of him taking up space and food and time in her house. Tsuji was also a bit of an outcast as far as personality. As he grew older, he loved fiction and mythology. He also loved romantic stories. He would even go on to write them and once even got suspended from school because he was apparently crafting these fantastical and romantic stories. And this was not a thing, especially for a boy to do, but especially during this time, during the wartime Japan, like once Japan entered the Second World War, is just not an okay thing to do. So his mother dying and then him becoming an orphan and being sent to uncaring relatives and then also being forced to deny sort of the natural desires of this, romantic life full of literature and storytelling. He really called all of these experiences together the first great tragedy of his life. And then came his experience in World War II. And actually, let's see, I'm going to take a little drink here from my sparkling water / soda before we get into this important topic. Still good. And actually, I think I am going to do one of the snacks here, which I bought some senbei, which is like a very traditional Asian, both Japanese but although I believe it's actually originally Chinese, rice cracker. They're like very extremely crunchy, made of rice flour and just like slightest bit sweet, but very, very old school. I think they've been in Japan for like over 1,000 years. Yes, very traditional. So let's give this a try. Yeah, that's great. Yum. Yeah, I could definitely eat the whole bag. All right. So I think many of us are at least somewhat familiar with Japan and World War II. We know about the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I want to talk about the last year of the war in Japan specifically and what it was like for normal people, like civilians, basically, like Shintaro Tsuji. In April of 1945, Tsuji entered university at a time when Japan they were suffering serious war fatigue, both mentally and emotionally, but also physically, from incredible poverty. There were extensive air raids conducted by Allied forces, and in order to avoid being drafted, basically, he didn't want to be sent to war. Tsuji decided to study chemical engineering instead of literature, which, of course, is what he actually wanted to do. Apparently, all the students who entered the literature programs or also like economics or education, when heading into college, those students were drafted immediately and often sent overseas. And luckily for Tsuji, he was quite good at math, so he decided that he would study chemistry. So not only then would he avoid being drafted, but in an interview, Tsuji also said that chemistry seemed like a little bit kind of romantic to him in a way, sort of mixing one chemical with another and then something new is born. Unfortunately, because of the war, his college was turned into a technological center for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The students were basically, their job was to conduct lots of research into certain chemicals and materials, all of course having to do with weapons and other warfare equipment. I found a story where Tsuji mentions having to conduct tests on parachute fabric. They had to basically find the best fabric for parachutes, and although there was some kind of silk that worked really well, the students in the other research were actually quite hopeful when one day they received a new kind of fabric to run tests on. Tsuji said that it was the best cloth that they had ever seen or tested. In terms of parachuting, it was far superior to that of any of the silk that they had found or tested. Unfortunately, this cloth was nylon, and it had come from the parachutes of the American prisoners of war. And what Tsuji says about this experience, basically closing the story, he says that, quote, "At that point, we realized that we were no match," end quote. I really can't even fathom what it must have been like for civilian Japanese. So much unknown, but also, like I said, so much fatigue, being really tired of the war and the bombings, and just sort of this ominous doom. I don't know. There was also little jobs and just little hope for what was the future. But I did find that there were some interesting, perhaps even sort of semi-positive spots to his college time too. I mean, even during this hellish time and also the sort of weary, listless days that directly followed the war, like during the occupation, Tsuji's entrepreneurial skills were impossible to contain. He made lots of things like soap and artificial sweetener, and also a special kind of soy sauce that contained MSG, and not to mention bootlegger booze. All of this was, of course, basically sold, like it's run by the Yakuza on the black market, because this was during a time when a lot of essential things like soap could only be found on the black market. So Tsuji and his fellow chemistry students sold these things and made a nice bundle of money, although it was such an unstable time. It was probably an incredible learning experience for him, not just practically, but also sort of boosting his confidence. Confidence that he could make something and then sell it. And by the way, apparently Tsuji ended up getting sick with tuberculosis, and really that's what kind of forced him to end his chemist bootlegger Yakuza adventure. Nevertheless, during this time, it seems as though really more than anything, though, what looms in his memory the most is just the war. In fact, every August, Tsuji writes of his war experience in the monthly Sanrio magazine / newspaper in Ichigo Shimbun, aka Strawberry News. I'll definitely be talking more about the Strawberry News magazine in the next episode, which is when the magazine was founded. But in August, he usually writes of a particular experience from July 7th, 1945. At this time, he has just returned to his hometown. He was apparently studying in his room when all of a sudden, outside his window is just red flames. American B-29s had begun dropping incendiary bombs across the town of Kofu, and his house was engulfed. He fled with his sister on his back, but everywhere he ran was fire. Almost all of the houses and shops and warehouses were made of wood. Nearly the entire town was destroyed. While fleeing, they even passed by a woman hunched over a water barrel, and nearby a man was trying to help her, but unfortunately her, along with the baby that she was carrying in her arms, had already passed away. This is an image that Tsuji seems to, even at 98 years old, cannot forget. Him and his sister make it to a sewage-filled river, and they stayed in the river a long time, just basically trying to stay safe from the flames. An absolute nightmare. A month later, Tsuji is back in college, and him, along with all of his fellow students, they gather together for the August 15th, 1945 speech by Emperor Hirohito, in which he announced Japan's surrender. When Tsuji and his classmates went back to their classroom, their teacher, who had been a lieutenant commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, he was found dead. He had shot himself. As a super side note here, if you haven't seen the Studio Ghibli film, Grave of the Fireflies, I recommend it for an honest look at what some everyday Japanese people had to go through during the last year of the war. I will warn you, though, the film is pretty brutal and will probably leave you utterly crushed. It's not for the faint of heart, for sure. But watching the story of a boy named Saita Yokokawa and his sister Setsuko, it does give some idea of what the fire bombings must have been like for Tsuji, even though in the movie it depicts the firebombing of Kobe, whereas Tsuji he had experienced them in Kofu. Nevertheless, the horror of violent war, as well as the alienation and cold reception that many orphans experienced during wartime Japan, the ones who were just flung sort of into distant relatives, into their houses, who often were struggling themselves and, maybe resentful of yet another mouth to feed. Well, all of this, it cannot be understated how much all of these experiences affected Tsuji and his sensibilities. And I think watching them in the movie kind of gives you an idea of what these experiences must have been like. So, yes. I mean, fortunately for Shintaro Tsuji, fortunately for his young life, though it was definitely plagued with trauma, it was very different from that of the siblings in Grave of the Fireflies. Tsuji, luckily, was an energetic young guy with college and entrepreneurial experience and some extra funds. So, he was able to continue making and selling things until even after university. With some family connections, he was able to get a very good job. That was not the case for the siblings in the movie. So there you go. That's my little recommendation for you if you can sit through it. Now we are going to come to another pivotal turning point in Tsuji's life. The job he got working for the Yamanashi prefectural government through some family connections. Although this job was extremely coveted by others in the community, it was definitely a respected job. Tsuji refers to this time period coming up as the second adversity after his boyhood. So, there's definitely going to be some problems there. However, it was during this, quote, second adversity that he ends up meeting and impressing a certain set of men with money and getting them to believe that he ought to invest in his lunatic of an idea of setting up a business called the Yamanashi Silk Center. Yes, for him, a new chapter was about to begin. Okay, hang in there, people. I promise this story of heartbreak and trauma, they definitely go somewhere, because every step of the way, from his life in a foreign Christian kindergarten through his experiences in World War II, they all kind of combine inside Shintaro Tsuji in a kind of swirling mass of powerful memories to ultimately drive him to make the kind of friendship-based company whose core philosophy is Nakayoku, getting along together. But before we dive in, I think it's definitely time to open up my next snack here, which is White Rabbit candy. Okay, now wait, hear me out here. I know this isn't Japanese, it's Chinese candy. But as I've mentioned, I really was looking for some classic kind of retro snacks for today's episode. And one of the snacks I immediately thought of was White Rabbit, which I was introduced to as a child when an exchange student arrived at my elementary school. And she had these with her. And would often just kind of share them. So they are a bit nostalgic for me for that reason. For those who don't know, these are one of those candies that has the edible rice paper. So you take off the outer wrapper, which for these features a cute little white rabbit, white bunny. And then on the inside, is this white candy that looks to have another wrapper on it, but it's in fact made of rice or some kind of starch. There's also a Japanese candy that's a little bit similar. I think it's botan rice candy, botan ame. And those are more citrusy, whereas this one, the White Rabbit, is kind of a creamy vanilla, like a sweetened condensed milk taste. I'm not much of a fan of the botan rice candy, the Japanese one that has the edible wrapper. Although I haven't had that one in a while, so I don't know. Maybe I would like it more. But I'm going to have one of these to continue the retro mood. All right. Let me up. And right, I haven't had one in a year or so, maybe, or maybe more. Yep. I forgot. It's quite hard. You have to kind of let it soften up a bit, but the rice paper will dissolve, and soon the creamy milk taste will come out. Yeah, these are so good. Yeah, very nostalgic. And also, I believe the company started, I don't know, I want to say maybe in the 40s. Maybe, I remember reading at one point, it was maybe after the Chinese Revolution that they started making these. So, you know, not just nostalgic for me. I know that for a lot of Chinese people and other Asian people where this was very accessible, this is also very nostalgic. So it keeps us in the retro-y mood. All right, let's continue on. So the war is over, and now Tsuji has to endure his second great adversity, which was a steady but soul-deadening job at the Yamanashi prefectural government. Remember, he is a naturally romantic and whimsical type of person, and so the job he got in the actuarial department, which I take it to sort of mean sort of like a clerk, or maybe he worked in like the registrar. This job was not for him, and he even tried to quit, and his colleagues or maybe his boss just kept convincing him to come back. I guess he did his job really well, and so they didn't want to lose him, and maybe because he was, you know, from a good family, etc., etc. He was then able to, through this job with the prefecture, sort of get a new type of job where he was able to set up a prefectural shop in Tokyo. At this shop, they sold different products and goods that were from Yamanashi, things that they were famous for and still famous for today: grapes, melons, and of course, silk. I think something must have clicked inside his brain during this time, that old sort of, I don't know, an entrepreneurial spirit. It just couldn't be kept inside for long. And so he eventually did actually quit the job. Of course, everyone thought he was like insane. He had worked for the Yamanashi prefecture for more than 10 years. I think it was nearly 13. And it had been a stable job, you know, with the future pension, the whole 9 yards. But he left it. However, he didn't leave it before convincing both his boss as well as some other colleagues that he wanted to sort of take this idea of the prefectural shop and bring it to the next level. He wanted to make it his. And so he convinced them to invest in it. And so between these men and also a local textile association, who I'm assuming was willing to invest some money because he was going to hawk their products in Tokyo, they all loaned him, I think it was like 200,000 yen each, which in that 2008 interview, Tsuji said was probably worth, 10 times that amount today. He also combined this sort of with he had a severance allowance and a little bit of savings. And so he took all this money and he went on his way with like 1 million yen capital and established the Yamanashi Silk Center in Tokyo. This was 1960. His business did well. He first kind of did fumble or fail a bit at selling alcohol. I think he was able to get like an alcohol license through his like old boss's family or something. These licenses were extremely expensive, hard to get, and he was able to get it, but it didn't work out. I think there's a story that literally where he talks about that, like, it was literally just too difficult of work, like hauling the alcohol boxes and bottles and barrels around was just too much. So he pivoted and started having some salesmen work for him, and they were just selling like crazy the regional fruit and the silk products. They would sell them to other stores, sort of like distribution sort of style, but then they also set up stalls in the outdoor markets. And he made money. It sounded like he was hustling, which is sort of what I mean by selling a ton or a lot. He was definitely making money and hustling, but it sounded like he was kind of nearly just only breaking even. And he really wanted something more. Actually, not just breaking even. I also remember he was a little bit, well, of course he was in debt because he had taken the investment money, but there was just kind of no way, even though the business wasn't failing per se, there was no way to sort of like catch up and bring it to the next level. It was around this time that his son, he had one son, and born in the 50s, his son was attending elementary school by this point. And he began those memories of his own young childhood, those impactful years at the Christian kindergarten with the birthday parties and the gift giving, well, it came back to him. He then asked the kids in his son's class if any of them had received birthday gifts. And only a few kids said yes, and those kids had received gifts, but only from their mother. Tsuji said that it was during this time when talking to his son and his son's classmates that he knew that he wanted to do a business related to birthdays and gift giving. And I think it was at this moment that the true spirit of Sanrio, that concept of small gift, big smile, was born. But wait, lest the magical feelings of the future flood of cute character trinkets carry you off, there was still a lot of footwork to do before Tsuji's mind had made the leap to Hello Kitty. And as mentioned, he'd sunk a lot of money into this business. He had investors to pay back, and it was essential that he pay off his debts. So with this pressure driving him and his mind churning on this idea of sort of the pure happiness of small gifts that even a child in 1960 could maybe buy with pocket money, well, it may have been fate that one of his female workers, I think she was a contractor, she arrived to a meeting with Tsuji with an accessory that had a cute strawberry illustration on it. Shintaro Tsuji, I'm sure, had already encountered sort of the strawberry boom because this had been happening since the 50s. But I think maybe this was the first time that he had encountered it after this big aha of his when in his kids' class. And he suddenly said that he thought it was just so cute. That's right. Like, almost like you can't even imagine a full-grown businessman saying this, but this was the reaction that Tsuji had. Oh, it's so cute. And so I think that word cute, we need to look back at where this idea of cute or kawaii came from. And the strawberry one in particular, much of this boom was due to an artist named Rune Naito. His work would come to heavily influence the many directions that Sanrio would go on to go in the 60s and the 70s. So we have to go on a little side quest and talk about the roots of kawaii. All right, gotta have another white rabbit. These are kind of addicting. All right. Okay. So, if you can believe it, kawaii existed before Hello Kitty. And if we're going to talk about the artist Rune Naito and his retro girl, which is the sort of character that he's known for, she also in a lot of the drawings or the illustrations does sport the strawberry motif, then we should probably also take one more step back and talk about what existed before World War II. Now, much of kawaii culture was cultivated and exploded in post-war Japan in the 1950s and 60s, but the deep roots had really already been laid way before that and were in the memories of those who were children or who were coming of age during World War II, like Shintaro Tsuji. Before the war, there was an explosion of a new kind of art style, illustration, and graphic design. So we should actually look at Rune Naito's mentor, Junichi Nakahara, and he was born in 1913. We could even take a step back before that and look at Yumeji Takahisa along with his wife. I mean, of course, technically we could probably go like way back, like to the Han period and talk about ink brush scrolls and painting prints of the Edo era. But I think the most obvious links to the modern concept of kawaii can definitely be seen in the early 20th century Japan. So, Yumeji Takahisa, he was born in 1884, and he is sort of considered by many to be the godfather of kawaii. And he was also definitely known as one of the leaders of the Japanese Taisho Romanticism art movement. This art movement, called Taisho Romanticism, it happened during the Taisho era, so 1912 to 1926, so that pre-World War II time. And Japan was really embracing Western culture. Do you remember your world history? For centuries, Japan had been in near total isolation. The trade and any relations between Japan and other countries were extremely limited and very, very controlled. And that went both ways. Foreigners were largely banned from coming, and normal everyday Japanese people were kept from leaving. So while there was some regular trade with China and Korea, and with basically just one European country, which was the Netherlands, Japan kept itself so isolated, and the Japanese people were then kept separate from anything that was going on outside of Japan. But that all ended in the 1850s when, after a couple of centuries of attempts by various Western powers, the United States Navy basically forced Japan to open for trade. And by force, I mean by the way of warships and lots of guns. So, by the way, a lot of isolationism was ending during the second half of the 19th century, in general around the world. Japan even basically copied America and forced Korea to open to trade in the 1870s. There seemed to be sort of this inevitable pull toward being more open and trading. The world was getting smaller. And so by the early 20th century, Japan had several decades of trade with the West and was readily and obviously fascinated. And that means things were pouring in from all around the world, especially Europe. As industrialization was driving new inventions, of course, there were improvements made upon printing and materials. And so you began to see new posters and picture postcards and all kinds of print ephemera everywhere. And Japan received its fair share of these published materials. Books and magazine covers began featuring beautiful women in an Art Nouveau style, which was in vogue at the time. I mean, come on, you know the type of art, that sort of classic flapper era styles, sinuous black lines, natural shapes, highly decorative lettering. Well, artists like Takahisa, aka the godfather of kawaii, he created in a very intentional way in this style. Interestingly, the West was equally fascinated by Japan and Japanese culture and art during this time, especially woodblock art. The first 10 or 15 years of the 20th century, there was like just an explode of international exchange. It's really kind of a shame, like looking back on it now, or at least I automatically think like what would have happened if World War I hadn't come along and wreaked so much havoc. However, in many ways, by Japan aligning itself with the Allies in World War I, Japan kind of emerged from that war with sort of a new confident identity from, being on the winning side. And their art and other cultural exports then spread even more. Artists like Yumeji Takahisa, he would have come of age at the turn of the 20th century. And so he would be soaking all of this up. He would then go on to design many book covers, magazine covers, featuring these elegant people, especially women, with sort of large, more Western-looking eyes, and those eyes looking very beautiful, but maybe full of melancholy. His subjects were also often in sort of ordinary settings, holding cats or playing cards or playing music. The necks were elongated, the lines black, flowers pinned in the hair, or flowers on the table, or flowers on the print kimonos, the fabric printed onto the kimono fabric that were then these women were wearing in the illustration. But really it was often, people said it was the eyes, those large eyes, that drew you in. And his work just ended up being very, like, it was everywhere. And it kind of was this new style scene in Japan. So I can kind of see maybe why he's sort of considered the god of kawaii. I did read one account that it was actually his wife that wrote the word kawaii on some sort of advertisement that they had made for a shop that they had opened together. And so maybe that's where that word kind of like clicked for the first time. So by the time Junichi Nakahara, sort of the next guy in line, who was born then in 1913, this world of Japan was just full of beauty, domestic and exotic, and he was born right into the time where the graphics were around him everywhere. By the time he ended up working, commercial illustrated imagery was more or less the norm. And so he enlarged the eyes even more. He thickened the lash line of all of these women. And he, of course, took full advantage of all of the new techniques that were being made in print. Yeah, all of his girls, sort of have rosy cheeks and the head tilted and just so sweet, so kawaii. He actually began as a dressmaker and a fashion illustrator, so it's not surprised that his work sort of eventually made it onto the covers of sort of the early shoujo magazines. Usually people will reference Nakahara as the sort of origin of shoujo magazines. Even though he wasn't making manga per se, he was more working in fashion, which is another theme. Like Run Naito also worked in fashion illustration and kind of moving into this more general kawaii type of advertising illustration and material. But it's really Nakahara who is often named as sort of that clear link of shoujo manga, which, by the way, it just basically means girls manga. But that link between shoujo manga and coming from the fashion era, he's considered the link. He really helped the burgeoning industry of shoujo manga and basically helped port it over from the fashion illustration onto these magazines that were meant for women, and it was more than just about illustration, which of course goes on to influence all of the future mangakas that are working in shoujo manga. It's kind of incredible that all this brightness and hope and artistic adventure and enterprise survived both the Showa financial crisis in the 1920s, but also the rise of militarism in the 30s, and of course the war then in the 40s. I mean, sometimes I imagine Shintaro Tsuji in kindergarten. He's having birthday parties and sharing gifts with his friends. surely he would have seen a lot of this early 20th century ephemera, be it wallpaper, wrapping paper, cards, perhaps any magazines his mother might have had around. It's like he not only is he soaking up all of the entrepreneurial spirit that I talked about before, but also his design sense, even though he's not a designer, sort of, well, just his sense of design, as well as the types of things that he felt comforting or joyful. It's all being directly influenced or through the lens of sort of this Japanese style Art Nouveau of the time. But remember, though Japan was devastated by World War II, the youth, after the war was over, they were looking for any little hope that could be found. Because in the decade after the war, remember, they were occupied by the Allied forces. Young kids were still kids. Of course, they were wanting toys, and teen girls and young women were looking for beauty. Perhaps even more so because of all the devastation around them. And so they needed that bit of a dream to sort of survive mentally and emotionally. It's the type of hope that gives you a flash of things that might be better in the future. So it's kind of no wonder that shoujo manga and its like corresponding styles really then exploded in the post-war period. Oh, and as a super side note, I read that Junichi, the fashion artist whose work appeared on the different covers of magazines, he was Rune Naito's mentor. Well, by 1940, Junichi Nakahara's illustrations, those depicting Western-style large-eyed women, were in fact no longer allowed to be published. I guess because the war was on and Japan basically wanted to have nothing to do with Western influences, including Western women. Apparently, he went on to do so anyway, which probably helped to kind of keep the momentum going enough to start his own women's magazine directly after the war in 1946. He started a magazine called Soleiru, I think. Yeah, Soleiru. And then he also started another magazine, I think, for slightly younger girls, Himawari, in 1947, and then another in 1954 called Junior Soleil. Soleiru. Soleiru is like it's sort of the Japanese pronunciation of, I believe, the French word soleil, which means sun. So I sometimes pronounce it the wrong way. But anyway, so this sort of new kawaii woman, that's all soft and cute, floral motifs, they were not going away. And if anything, the demand for this type of imagery and all of the hope that it brought, it was only growing. So of course, that female contractor of Shintaro Tsuji, of course, by the early 1960s, she had an accessory covered in a cute and accessible strawberry motif. I'm sure that contractor had seen the art of Junichi Nakahara's understudy, Rune Naito, because Rune had worked on one of Nakahara's magazines. I think it was Junior's Soleil. And he not only mimicked Nakahara's style, but also exaggerated it even more. So sort of the third set of exaggeration, or is it the second? But he made so just as Nakahara exaggerated Takahisa style, now under Rune Naito, the necks are getting even longer, the eyes, if you can believe it, even bigger, and the hair often browner, blonder, as Japan's fascination with the West sort of exploded once more. This was a time where, the war had ended, now the occupation is done, things were starting to improve. The middle class of Japan is growing, and sort of the fantasy of the West was all around in Japan, especially in places like Tokyo. By the way, go find Rune Naito's illustration of his retro girl. He drew her many different ways, but you could also look up, Rune Naito's strawberry retro girl, and you'll see why, or I think you'll see why, a light bulb had to have gone off inside Shintaro Tsuji's head. All right. So the making of joyful trinkets is about to begin. We've arrived at another big milestone here. So I think because of that, we should definitely open up a new drink, the ramune, which I haven't had one of these in years. So let's see if I can get into it. There we go. Once again, this is white peach. Oh, look at the marble there. Very, very nostalgic. All right, let's see if I can get this on microphone, punching it down. Got to get this little plunger out of the cap. Okay, here we go. Let's press the marble down. There we go. Hopefully, there we go. Okay, thought for a second it was going to overflow. And there's the marble. All right, let me give this a try. I don't know if the little marble can be heard rolling around. Not really. All right. Doesn't smell like anything, but yeah. Kind of tastes like white peach. I don't know. It's just kind of sweet to me. But like I said, I don't know. I don't drink a lot of soda, so I'm probably not the best judge. Okay, let's go on. The strawberry motif. Well, you've guessed it. He took that strawberry motif and he put it on everything. The most famous product being strawberry sandals. But he also put it on bags and teacups and teapots and coin banks and little coin purses and a bunch of other stuff. And it sold extremely well. In fact, it sold much better than any of their plain products, like just, that were solid colors or whatever. They also tried a floral pattern that also did quite well. And that's when, of course, Tsuji realized the cuteness of the strawberries and the flowers added value in people's minds. The Yamanashi Silk Center had its hit product. And I want to be clear, though, based on the interviews with him, as well as people's recollections, Tsuji also genuinely enjoyed these products. Like I mentioned before, he himself thought they were very cute. So it wasn't just about him being like a super savvy businessman. I mean, clearly he was keenly looking for something to make his business a success. But I think he was honestly also looking for something to satisfy his own inner desire for cuteness, that sort of comfort and joy that had been lost during his young years. And I think he also knew that for other people, that they would enjoy this comfort and cuteness as well. And because of his childhood war experience, I think he was adamant that, he really believed that serious violent conflict was 100% bad and that it should be something to be avoided at all costs. And that by communicating with people, perhaps even strengthening that communication by exchanging little gifts, that perhaps another war could be avoided. So a business success was definitely happening here. A sector of goods that are basically, they're called fancy goods. I think in Japanese it's like fanshi goods. And it was like just beginning to spread across Japan. And the Yamanashi Silk Center, as well as the individual artists that they were beginning to contract with, they were there at the very beginning of this sort of fancy goods trend. And fancy goods tended to be, sort of frilly or slightly ornate or decorated, but also usually cheap and kind of small and almost exclusively marketed toward girls. So yes, this burgeoning business success was happening with these fancy goods. But also an emotional success too. Tsuji was creating the products, the gifts that he had wanted not just as a child, but probably also what he had wanted for his son and his son's peers. Tsuji had a connection to the things that he was making, and he wanted more. So it was inevitable that Tsuji would make a leap to contracting the sort of popular and upcoming Japanese manga and kawaii artists of the time, because these were the people making the cute, adorable, and joyful art during that time period. And it wasn't just Run Naito and his Strawberry Retro Girl. There were a lot of other artists like Setsuko Tamura, Kimihiko Tsukuda, Takahashi Yanase, who I will definitely talk about later, and perhaps most influentially at this time in the 1960s, Ado Mizumori, aka Ado-chan. Oh my gosh, I have to take another drink of this soda after butchering all of those Japanese names. Very much apologies to those people and their families. Did you hear the glass marble on that drink? What a satisfying sound. So Tsuji commissioned and licensed these people's art and basically just plastered all of his products with them. Now, normally the artists seemed to be quite involved. So it wasn't just like he took their, got the license for their art and like never talked to them again. A lot of them were already licensing their art to other companies. This was definitely something that the artists were involved with and seemed to want to do and were encouraged by. And he put it on practically every product. He tried every single product, which honestly is not dissimilar to the way he runs Sanrio today. No, he's not the one in charge anymore, day to day, but he still has influence. And it's honestly still the way that Sanrio generally operates. I don't know. It's just kind of interesting to me that Tsuji was already doing this well before Hello Kitty was even a twinkling apple in someone's eye. Of course, some products were hits, some weren't, but he was always watching and learning. From the very beginning, the company sort of adopted a mode of just trying a ton of different things, being quite free and liberal with their experiments, which was very different from most of the other Japanese businesses, which tended to be pretty conservative and risk averse. At the Yamanashi Silk Center, they tried a ton of different stuff and they kept what worked and just ditched the stuff that didn't. And so by the mid-1960s, Tsuji was fully embracing this artistic movement that we now call retro kawaii. This time period just had an explosion of cute characters, and it sort of, as we categorize it now, it runs from about the 1960s, maybe late 50s, all the way through the 80s. And it wasn't happening just inside the Yamanashi Silk Center, but other companies as well. Artists were popping up everywhere. One of these artists involved in this movement was Ado Mizumori, often affectionately known by her stage name, Ado-chan. So by the time Shintaro Tsuji had contacted her, she had already gained fame for her cute and often slightly nude, bare-bottomed girls. Ado-chan went on to create a specific character for Sanrio, known as Mitan, which supposedly in Japanese means sort of like meowy meow. So just a really cutesy name for this little cat character named Mitan, which, yes, I think it's in Matt Alt's book. I have it here, but I don't think I'm going to take the time to look it up. I think he points out that is definitely a little bit of a, foreshadowing for Sanrio's other famous cute character to come. So Ado-chan, like I mentioned before, she was definitely directly involved in the production of the various goods. And in 1965, Mitan debuted as a little ceramic trinket. And it was crazy popular. It sold extremely well. And that's in 1965. I mean, that's nearly a decade before Hello Kitty even comes out. it would honestly even be like another year or two before the name Sanrio is even used. In fact, the Miton cat character, along with her other flirty girl characters, like they became so big that an event was even held called the Ado Festival, which was held inside a Tokyo department store. Her playful mix of sort of flirty and fun and kawaii was an absolute hit. It was like kind of people were obsessed with this sort of like these Western, and also like when I look at it, it looks kind of definitely like flower child, hippie, or maybe even tropical, which makes sense because I believe Auto-chan spent like a year, like a gap year in Hawaii. So maybe that's where some of that influence came from. But her characters and art really helped turn around the semi-struggling Yamanashi Silk Center. Because like I mentioned, they weren't like totally failing, but they had been kind of stuck in this spot where it was hard to grow into the kind of company that Tsuji wanted. I mean, they definitely had made some successful choices, right? Pivoting from selling alcohol and produce and silk products to selling more home goods and trinkets. That was definitely an important pivot. Adding the flowers and the strawberries was another important pivot. But I think even the year after that, they had tried like cherries instead of strawberries, and was kind of hoping they would kind of make a whole, fruit run and have them all be successful. And for some reason, they weren't, which was one of the reasons that kind of pushed him to begin expanding and using different artists and trying their artwork. And of course, bam, he hit on success with Miton, and that really helped catapult the company into where he was hoping to go. The lesson we are learning so far: keep going. Keep going, keep trying, keep experimenting. As long as you keep going, you're going to find this successful route. It will be it's sort of a windy one. It's never a straight line, but you must just keep going. So, yes, Tsuji's eye for these artists and what was happening in the art world, what was popular and whatnot, as well as his business drive, is definitely helping him to be successful and begin paying back his debts. And because of his childhood and upbringing, he sort of had this like third secret sauce, this sort of emotional drive to have a business that's centered around small giftable objects. All of them adorned with cute, heartwarming artwork. And this is really what I see as the foundation for what Sanrio is today. The Small Gift, Big Smile Foundation has now been 100% laid, and the capital is flowing in. Okay, let's go on a little side quest before we move on, because I think we got to talk a little bit more about Auto-chan, because she was so much more than just this creator of Mitan. I really highly recommend looking up videos and pictures of her. She's still alive and as far as I can tell, also still working. She was born in 1939. And throughout her career, like I mentioned, she was not just an artist, but she was also a writer and an actress and a singer. In Japan, she's especially known for her jazz singing. She would also, like sing at like, jazz clubs and things like that. And I think she was performing up until at least like a few years ago. Oh yeah, another side fun fact. One of her songs is on the original Katamari Damacy soundtrack. It's so good. Anyway, she just is the kind of person who seems to have lived like 5 different lives in one lifetime with all of her projects and performances. For a long time, actually, she had a super popular children's program on NHK where she would sort of sing songs and do drawings on this like big clear acrylic board that was suspended between her and the audience. And so she would sort of draw, for her, it would be like backwards, and she would draw with both hands. She's even done this on like some store windows in the past like 10 years in various like pop-up shops for her merchandise. Her art, and of course trinkets and the other goods that her art was plastered on, still seems to be extremely popular. Both old and young people flock to buy it. She is energetic and fun. Like all the videos I've seen of her, like even when she's in her 80s, I can still see why her and Tsuji like really gelled, at least back then. Like, I don't know if they keep in touch now, but I just think their energy is quite similar, and that drive to do and try like a lot of different things. What a boon! Like her and her energy and art were to the Yamanashi Silk Center. I honestly really wonder if the company would have survived, or if it had, if it would have become the Sanrio we know. It's hard to imagine it without Otto Mizumori's influence. Perhaps one day I'll have to do an episode just focusing on her. And oh my gosh, can you believe it? Like there's no English Wikipedia page for her. I feel like I have to remedy that when I have time. Yeah, right. How many times did I say that in the Sylvanian Families episode? I need to fix the Wikipedia page. Yeah, we'll see about that. Tsuji's company has survived and is finally beginning to thrive. And in 1966, the Yamanashi Silk Center began to publish gift and concept books, mostly poetry books, but also heavily illustrated folk and fairy tale books. And one of the people involved in this new venture was a man named Takashi Yanase. That's right, the creator of Anpanman came to work for Shintaro Tsuji. Anpanman is a Japanese superhero first popularized in a series of picture books and then later in an anime. The Anpanman character is basically, he's a superhero and his head is a red bean bun. Yep, that's right. And should have just said this out the gate, he's pretty much the most successful Japanese character, like in Japan, like the most popular one amongst little kids. Like basically every kindergartner across the entire country probably knows and loves Anpanman. Takashi Yanase created Anpanman in 1973, and he would continue basically to create books all the way until I believe he died in the early teens, like 2013, I believe. According to various sources, Anpanman has been Japan's top grossing character, like through at least 2019. So that's why I'm not quite sure what it's like now in 2026, but yeah, it's a huge character, and it's quite bizarre actually that he isn't a more well-known outside of Japan. I assume just because his sort of concept is perhaps a little bit hard for a lot of the audience to grasp, because red bean and red bean paste, like the adzuki bean, is like not super popular outside of Asia. That's my assumption anyway. But huge in Japan and in other parts of Asia. I mean, because one of the main reasons, merchandise, of course. There is Anpanman merchandise, everything. I mean, every imaginable kind of product or good. It's a little bit like Hello Kitty nowadays. There is an Anpanman on it. So 150 billion yen, apparently, worth of books and merchandise sold every year. That's pretty wild. Also, a little bit of a side note. Apparently, Anpanman was the inspiration for One Punch Man. I had no idea. Yeah, so One Punch Man, Anpanman, like cousins. Okay, so, and I had no idea about that until I was researching this episode and doing a little bit more research on Takashi Yanase. So before Yanase even created Anpan Man, he was already working as an illustrator and also a script writer, and he had been contracted by Tsuji to create some designs for various products, sort of like Ado-chan was doing. Remember this. Not only before Anpan Man, this is like before Anpan Man, and this is like when Sanrio was still the Yamanashi Silk Center. Okay, so Sanrio wasn't even like a thing yet, and all of this was happening. In 1966, Yanase was planning to self-publish a collection of his poems, and Tsuji, with his sort of ever-present sense of what might sell and trying something new, he offered to have the Yamanashi Silk Center publish the poetry book. And that book ended up being the company's first publication. It's called Songs I Love, a poetry collection. Or sometimes it's translated to like beloved songs. Anyway, Yanase designed the entire book himself, and Tsuji seemed to approve. And so I think, he kind of saw the book as an easy, but also like a heartfelt thing that people could give as a gift. I think there was a quote of him saying, it promoted, beauty and understanding. So it aligned perfectly well with his desire to create gifts that bring happiness. And it turns out he was right, because the book was incredibly popular, and they went on to publish 5 total volumes of Yanase's poetry. Before and after this, Yanase had also published plenty of poetry and prose and also picture books. And some of these were then adapted into animes under the direction of Osamu Tezuka. Yes, indeed, that Osamu Tezuka, the titan of manga and anime, the creator of Astro Boy, or how I was actually introduced to him was the manga Dororo. Like Tsuji and Yanase, Tezuka came of age during World War II. He was heavily affected by not only the war, but also the occupation and aftermath. In the early days, he realized that his manga could help convince people to care about the world, and ostensibly sort of this idea that it's the same idea that Tsuji had, that maybe his work could help avoid future wars. Yeah, very, very much in line with both Tsuji and Yanase. And so this is just a little bit of a spoiler for the future. Tezuka would later get involved with Shintaro Tsuji and Sanrio via Sanrio's short-lived shoujo magazine called Lyrica. Yep, that's right. You heard it. Sanrio will go on to publish a shoujo magazine, if you can believe it. But that will be covered in the next episode. Anyway, while I don't exactly get the impression that these guys, Tsuji and, Yanase of Anpanman fame and Tezuka, they didn't seem to necessarily be super buddy-buddy. The 60s were clearly a time when people were, I've mentioned, there's just like explosion of creativity. The immediate after effects of the war beginning to sort of recede. True prosperity is finally coming. And so their creativity was being used and stretched and displayed in a ton of different contexts, whether it was merchandise, anime, manga, poetry books, you name it. So when Yanase's poetry sold well, it was kind of no wonder that the Yamanashi Silk Center, very soon to be using the Sanrio name, by the way, well, they saw their next move. Let's make a whole line of gift books. Sanrio was, in fact, a pioneer in the sort of burgeoning field of books as gifts. But for the company, honestly, it seemed like the books were just, they kind of treated them just like any of the other trinkets or goods that they were making. They saw it as something that brings joy to the recipient. As a writer myself, and as a person who reads, I think this is just a fabulous thought. I love books as objects as well as containing stories and information. And so I think in the end that this was a really cool direction that they went in. Anyway, after a year passes with Yanase's poetry books coming out and selling well, in 1967, they begin publishing a new series basically called mini book series. And this was a series of small books. Like they were literally about palm sized. I think like about like a little more than like 10 centimeters tall. And they featured artwork and words by many of the artists that I've already mentioned. There were apparently like 13 of these published in all. They had titles like A Bouquet of Love or Girls in Love. I believe that one was a Rune Naito book. Or there was Mother, a poetry and illustration collection. These were all done by well-known poets and lyricists. Like I think Bouquet of Love was by Kimihiko Tsukuda, who was a well-known newspaper comic strip artist at the time. So the publications continued, and they even did yet another series, which they titled kind of similarly, just called a gift book series. And so these were like almost twice as big, and I think the early editions even had like a space on the cover to write the giver and receiver's names, which is kind of interesting and really shows that these were really meant as gift objects. As with the first mini book series, lots of well-known poets and artists and lyricists published individual books in this second round, and again, they sold really well. Unfortunately, nowadays it can be definitely difficult to find these books. Even finding pictures of them were pretty, like pictures of the covers was quite difficult until I bought a Japanese book called 70s and 80s Sanrio design, which, as I mentioned, is totally in Japanese, but I was able to translate a lot of it as I researched these episodes, and they do have a really nice spread in here of the pictures of a lot of these books, and the cover art is super groovy, a sort of mixture of cutesy, like retro cute, retro kawaii, but also kind of romantic and stylish, very much of its era. I will probably post a picture, maybe not of the whole spread, but of a few of these, just because it's so hard to find these pictures anywhere on the internet, and the illustration is so different from what we would normally see of the Sanrio characters. But it's interesting because you can really see that Sanrio, or the company that would become Sanrio, is embracing what is happening and what is popular at the time, and really kind of throwing everything on the wall and seeing what sticks. Go look for those pictures that I'll definitely post for this episode. But there was another thing coming. Another thing that definitely was another turning point for Sanrio. And it started with the idea of American licensing. During this time, Shintaro Tsuji's dreams began to grow. He had his eyes on the growing trends in America. He apparently is a huge film buff, and he was definitely watching American movies, most notably Disney animation. He saw the power and the reach of these American brands, and from what I can tell, by the mid to late 60s, he was beginning to have big plans. Firstly, Tsuji knew that he could bring some of these big franchises to Japan. He even tried Mattel's Barbie. Apparently he did win the license for Japan, but the dolls were difficult to sell. They were expensive to produce and weren't very popular when compared to domestic dolls like Lika-chan. Additionally, I read that in general, the dolls, as well as the Barbie accessories, they were just sort of considered too big. Most Japanese homes, especially those in big cities and in places like probably like Tokyo and Osaka, were often smaller than their counterparts in America. And so in a practical way, many people just didn't have enough room, and smaller dolls like Lika-chan, which debuted in 1967, just fit better. And that definitely tracks with what I learned during my research for Sylvanian families, the last two episodes. One of their biggest advantages is the small scale of the doll. Compare a Sylvanian family's or calico critter figure with a Barbie doll, and it's easy to see how Barbie was just considered too big. Interestingly, the worldwide Barbie, like Barbie for the American market and beyond, they were originally manufactured in Japan right from the beginning when the doll debuted in the 1950s. But despite that, the doll never gained a foothold in the Japanese market. Little side note here, Mattel and Takara, the maker of the Lika-chan doll, they would go on to collaborate in the 1980s, making a Japanese version of Barbie, generally known as the Takara Barbie. It was pretty much a success, although definitely still nowhere near as successful as Lika-chan. But the partnership between the two companies eventually ended, and the doll's name was changed to Jenny. There is a whole fascinating history of Mattel and Barbie in Japan with interesting facts about American licensing in Japan and East Asia in general. But just as Shintaro Tsuji left Barbies behind, so too must we. He did meet the owner of Hallmark, like Hallmark greeting cards, and he had a bit of a stroke of fortune because he won the Japanese license. And as far as I could find, it's interesting, during this time, like when he was doing the negotiating for the Hallmark license, this was right around the time when they began to use Sanrio as sort of a publishing imprint. Maybe somebody would even maybe call it a subsidiary. So someone, I assume Tsuji, began to realize Yamanashi Silk Center as a name was a bit of a mouthful and not super easy for foreigners to remember or maybe even to say, maybe especially Americans. And so they came up with the Sanrio name as they began exploring these foreign licenses. Okay, we finally have come to sort of talking about Sanrio being used. So we've got to talk about the name, right? Oh, and actually, right before we do, I do have one more snack, which is Pocky. I think everybody knows the Pocky, like the biscuit sticks that traditionally, anyway, have chocolate on them. This is actually another snack that's been around for a super long time, and even though it maybe feels a little bit modern, is definitely from that era. I think I remember reading on Wikipedia that it was first sold in the mid-60s, like 1966 or 67, so it's right around the same time that we're talking about, so why not have some? All right, these I've had many times. Okay. Apparently the name is sort of an onomatopoeia for the sound of these sticks cracking. Let's see if I can get one out and crack it. It's like the tiniest little crack. Okay. So Sanrio, the name, where did it come from? Well, over the years, Tsuji and others have given basically two explanations for where this name came from. The first explanation is a bit whimsical. The second is much more straightforward, I would say. The first explanation involves the Spanish words san, as in saint, and then rio, as in river. So, saintly or holy river. In the 90s through the 2010s design book, so that's a second Japanese book that I bought when doing the research for these podcasts, or for this whole Sanrio series. There's a second book, and in that book, there's an explanation. Oh, and of course, I'm using Google Translate here, so hopefully it's semi-accurate. The explanation basically says civilizations once arose in lands where majestic rivers flowed. And so they too wanted to create a culture that resonated with the world. There was also a 1976 company brochure that I found, and in that brochure it said that, quote, "The sacred river continues to flow today, nurturing the happiness of people around the world," end quote. Tsuji himself explained years later, and once again, I have to do another quote, and this one is from Matt Alt's book, Pure Invention, and in it, he quotes Tsuji as saying, "The world's great civilizations flourished along rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, the Yellow. That's what I was thinking when I named us, to promote our creation of a brand new culture." The second explanation usually is used mostly in a more Japanese context, and this involves the sort of explanation of the original company's name and the kanji used for it, along with the different ways to read that kanji. So it turns out that Yamanashi can also be read as Sanri. Right, Sanri. That's only one letter missing. Some people say that the letter O was added at the end because it kind of implies the sound a person might make if they are happily excited. Others have said that the O just sounds like a reference to man or king. So Yamanashi King, the king or lord of Yamanashi. Yeah. Apparently, Tsuji himself has never confirmed any of these coincidences with the name. So it's hard to say how the name actually came about. And maybe it doesn't really matter because either way, the name Sanrio was born. And for a few years, it was actually used in conjunction with either the name Yamanashi Silk Center or with the acronym YSC. In fact, the first Sanrio logo, and so far, like in 2026, there have been 4 different Sanrio logos. The first had a kind of like jester, or a clown attached to the letters YSC, which then sat above the word Sanrio. And there's like an SAN, and then a dash, and then an RIO. In that 90s to 2010s design book that I mentioned, this logo apparently with YSC can supposedly be traced all the way back to 1963. So I don't know, maybe they were experimenting quite early. But at least by 1969, the clown and the YSC are dropped, and there's just simply the English spelling of just Sanrio, SAN with the dash and the RIO in kind of a swoopy font. And it's with this logo, along with the name Sanrio Greetings, that Tsuji uses to begin marketing licensed goods, notably, as mentioned before, Hallmark. So he's first gonna give American greeting cards a try. It's kind of interesting or maybe sad because apparently like greeting cards weren't very popular in Japan at the time. Like you wouldn't just send a card in the mail for somebody's birthday, or like you wouldn't give like a get well card or just a thank you card like people in America might. In Japan, you might send a small card, but it would always be attached to a small gift, neatly or beautifully wrapped. Now, as far as I could tell, these regular greeting cards didn't sell very well, but Hallmark did have a sort of sleepy, lovey-looking panda character, which in Japan they called Panda-chan, and this apparently was a pretty good, like it was a hit and it did sell. And I even read in one of the books that Panda-chan at the time was actually a lot of people's first exposure to pandas, which I don't know why I got hooked on this fact. And so I had to go on a little deep dive about why this was. And it was when I was doing this research that I found out that pandas wouldn't actually arrive to Japan until 1972 when they arrived to the Ueno Zoo. So let's go on a little side quest here because really, who doesn't love pandas? Plus, I'm going to eat a little bit more Pocky. One of the reasons why I want to do this side quest is because it really is a kind of an interesting case study about soft power. And spoiler alert, these days, the company of Sanrio and its characters have a lot to do with Japanese soft power. So, Japan has basically continuously hosted giant pandas from China since their initial arrival to the Ueno Zoo in 1972. I guess, okay, it's kind of rude to talk a lot and chew, so I'm going to pause with the Pocky. I guess China sort of, I had no idea about this at all. China deploys these giant pandas around the world, which are lent out, by the way. They don't give them, they lend them out. The Chinese government owns and controls all the pandas and their offspring. And in general, the pandas are basically kind of like a symbol of friendship. You know, like nice diplomatic ties. It's a kind of like political leverage. In fact, in 1941, China loaned a panda to the USA. 1941, yes, during the height of the war between the Chinese and the Japanese. That part of World War II that a lot of us in the West don't hear about much. Anyway, so China sends a panda to the USA, basically hoping it might leverage some goodwill, which translates into political power. Later, after the Communist Revolution in China, they begin sending pandas to various countries that they want to align themselves with. You know, every ally gets a panda kind of thing. Obviously, this whole setup only works if the general public is interested in and wants pandas in the first place, which most people do because, like I said, who doesn't love pandas? But, you know, who would have thought that an animal could really soften attitudes towards China? But that's basically one of the ways that they were being used. So, fast forward to today or to more recently, after returning 4 pandas last year from, I think, a zoo or someplace in Wakayama, and then the remaining 2 pandas from the Ueno Zoo Park this past January in Japan, for the first time in more than 50 years, there are no giant pandas right now in Japan. And this was like huge news. It's kind of incredible to me that like when Tsuji first got the Hallmark license and introduced the Panda-chan character, that many people didn't even know what a panda was. Like, how many people did Tsuji introduce pandas to, like by way of the Sanrio greetings / Hallmark licensed goods? I mean, obviously pandas came to be greatly loved by the Japanese public. I mean, it was a love that grew so much over the decades that the Ueno Zoo neighborhood, like around the park, has come to be known for the animal itself, which there's a hot tip for anybody who wants like a lot of panda trinkets to go there on your next Japan trip. But now the pandas are all gone. Back to China they went and their offspring. So I don't know. Many people I read in some of the news articles are actually quite worried, especially business people, because, they make panda trinkets and panda merchandise and panda themed food, a bunch of like tourism based companies. They're wondering basically what's going to happen economically now that all the pandas are gone. And in one Japan Times article that I read, like, said that the effects could kind of, ripple out and affecting other tourism-based businesses like hotels and restaurants. Yeah, I don't know. Not to mention all the other businesses that rely on foot traffic for the area. So I don't know what will happen during this pandaless period. By the way, the return of the pandas earlier this year, I guess, was a thing that was long scheduled and agreed upon a long time ago, so it doesn't necessarily signal anything political in regards to Chinese-Japanese relations in 2026. And it seems like most of the leaders are fairly confident that they will have pandas again, but they just don't know when because China fully controls them. So there you go. There's how pandas are related to soft power. All right, so Tsuji and his company are making money, but he's also spending money, creating an ever-flowing flow of products. I mean, ever-growing flow of products, and even opening up their first store, which was called Tsuruya Crane, and it was in a building in Ginza, and they opened in 1967. And here they sold all of their different products and all of those publications, all of those books. Before this, the Yamanashi Silk Center, they had sold products in a lot of other department stores or maybe like pop-up type events, but never their own store. So this was kind of a big deal. So things are obviously moving in the right direction. But once again, he's also bleeding money with all of these expenses and now rent and I'm sure insurance, not to mention the tons of licensing fees that he's having to pay for all of these different artists. So once again, he finds himself, his company isn't exactly failing, but he really needs still yet a bigger stream of income to accomplish what is now on his mind. And lucky for him, in 1968, Shintaro Tsuji won the Japanese license to Charles Schulz's Peanuts. This was a lifesaver for Tsuji. Snoopy proved, as you probably already know, just as popular in Japan as he was in America, and the trinkets and goods began pouring out of factories. The items created during this time are extremely collectible. For example, if you have, a couple $100, a mohair Snoopy plushie with a Sanrio Japan tag can be yours, but you're going to be forking out hundreds of dollars. This was kind of an interesting period of time for Peanuts because in the 1960s, Snoopy was still like a little bit of a side character. My son has been collecting the complete Peanuts comic books, and I think it's like a series. There's a ton of them. I think there's like 25 or 26, and they cover the entire 50-year run of Charles Schulz's comic. I think we have about 8 of them, which brings us to the mid-60s. And when I was flipping through that, I saw that this was definitely a time where Snoopy was there, but he was just kind of one of many characters featured. Charlie Brown was still very much the star. But you could kind of see that the dog was gaining traction. He's beginning to have strips of his own where no one else is appearing in them, and he definitely has a personality. Supposedly, Tsuji told Schulz that he really ought to make Snoopy be the main star. And I suppose in a lot of ways, at least globally, like how Peanuts is known, that is what happened. Now, there are a lot of stories involving Shintaro Tsuji and Charles Schulz, and I hate to bring this up again because I feel like I'm a broken record, but guess when Charles Schulz was born? Yep, the 1920s, meaning he came of age and was even drafted into the army during World War II. As far as I could find, he was deployed to Europe and never fought in the Pacific Theater, but undoubtedly his experiences affected him greatly, just like the other people I've talked about. And while they weren't exactly friends, Schulz and Tsuji seem to have a very good partnership for several years. Until they, didn't. More recent memories from Tsuji, he claims that he told Schulz that he ought to make Snoopy the star of the comic, and that then after that, Schulz followed the advice and boosted Snoopy's presence and also brought Woodstock, the little yellow bird, into the forefront with him. There is a definite disagreement about when this suggestion of Tsuji's came about. In the late 1960s, when he began licensing Peanuts in Japan? Is that when? Or later? when Hello Kitty was a success, which would have been like post 1974, 1975. If Tsuji actually acquired the license in 1968, which is what I've been able to find, which, by the way, 1968, that would have been 2 years after the Peanuts animation. It's The Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown, which features Snoopy quite a bit. I don't know. I just have a hard time believing that Tsuji's comments were really the thing that had the real effect on Schultz. It seems as though Schultz or somebody close to him, like that they were already beginning to make Snoopy a popular character. But I think kind of regardless, this is what is certain. Tsuji was definitely looking at what was happening outside of Japan, like for sure. He was not just sort of an insulated type of guy, hyper focused on Japan. And in fact, as a bit of a spoiler for not only the next episode featuring Sanrio in the 1970s, but also in a future episode talking about the 2010s, you gotta wonder if Tsuji wasn't just like, maybe he wasn't just looking at the USA. I think he was also looking at Europe. In both of these future episodes, we'll be discussing Sanrio's, we'll call it problematic bunny characters and their unfortunate resemblance to a certain famous Dutch rabbit character by the name of Nijntje, or as she's known internationally, Miffy. Dutch illustrator Dick Bruna is, by the 1960s, already working very diligently on his little white bunny character in her stories, Miffy having been invented in the mid-1950s, so well before any iteration of Sanrio was founded. Will I be verging on the obnoxious if I mention that Dick Bruna was also born in the 1920s? In fact, in 1927, the same year as Shintaro Tsuji? Yeah, okay, I'll leave it alone. Anywho, it's quite hard, back to sort of Peanuts and Sanrio. It's hard to find direct references nowadays to Peanuts from Sanrio's point of view. In fact, if you look at the official company history, like on the websites in both English and Japanese, I really wasn't able to find much in reference to the company's early forays into foreign character or intellectual property licensing. But without a doubt, the company's decision to do this, particularly with the Peanuts license, had an effect on not just the company's capital, but it seemed to be sort of, I don't know, I'll put it like this, like another step in Tsuji's education about the business of licensing. Because as the 1960s was drawing to a close, this was definitely on his mind. The company was bleeding licensing fees, and so the wheels must have been turning. Thoughts of creating his company's own characters must have been forming in his head. All right, so we're coming to the end of the decade. Everything that was happening toward the end of the 1960s pointed toward Sanrio's future. In March of 1968, the Yamanashi Silk Center exhibition was held at the Tokyo Prince Hotel, a grand hotel that celebrated its 60th anniversary in 2024. It's located right next to Tokyo Tower, which I believe was being built at the time, or maybe late 50s or so. It was also quite new. And then the Zojoji Temple. The hotel still stands today with, based on historical photos that I found, a nearly unchanging facade. Understandably, that means that it has a very Showa retro look. I'm not sure what the hotel has today in the way of exhibition space, but it used to have an area called the Kamari Hall where it would hold small exhibitions. I assume that maybe this is where the Yamanashi Silk Center exhibition was held. Apparently, this area has now been replaced by the hotel's fancy first floor elevator hall, but there's still a massive, unchanged, like mosaic artwork wall that you can still go see. In the 1960s, the hotel had ballrooms, event halls, luxury shops, restaurants, a tea room, and it was a sort of a trailblazer in the movement toward Western-style hotels that were more accessible to the growing middle class and also the foreigners that were beginning to visit. So I don't think it's surprising that the Yamanashi Silk Center exhibition was held there. Although the hotel gets mixed reviews these days, I found some people were calling it nostalgic and traditional. Others were calling it tired and outdated. It would be so cool to see some kind of collaboration between these two companies again. I don't know. Maybe I'm just like, from all these snacks and all this history, I'm just like being very nostalgic right now. I'm not really sure. But either way, it's kind of amazing that by the end of this decade, after nearly 10 years, Tsuji's company is like so popular that they can actually put on an exhibition. The following year, in 1969, an experimental Sanrio sales area called the Strawberry Shop was actually opened in a restaurant in San Francisco, California, in America. As far as I could find, this was the first overseas shop, although it seems to have been more of like a pop-up shop in a shop. But once again, this was another clue that the company had their eye on foreign buyers. They were looking outside of Japan. And this was the first of many brick and mortar adventures, including the first in a really long line of future overseas stores. And it wasn't just Tsuji and his growing fancy goods company, we'll call it, who is ending the decade with a bang. Sign after sign of what the future would hold was exploding around Sanrio, the company, but also Japan in general. This is the late 60s. And honestly, not just Japan, but the whole world. Protests are happening everywhere, basically. The end of the 60s was this time of huge change and growth for basically the whole world. And in Japan, there's the university protests in 1968 and 69. And while they weren't ultimately like cohesive enough to make any very large scale change, and in fact, a lot of ways from what I read, like it honestly kind of damaged the image of the left in Japan. There was, though, a rise of Japanese feminism as women were often treated very unfairly, like within the protest groups. And so this was something that was brought up after the protests were over. And yeah, feminism grew in Japan because of that. I would say the main thing seems to be that the protests sort of left this entire generation of people a bit disillusioned, but also very aware that the world was changing, that a new era was being birthed. And in a way, it was kind of like a turning point. They were going from a post-war era really into a new dawn. And it made sense. There was now a whole generation of people who had now totally lived and come of age and had never experienced the war firsthand, and perhaps only had sort of vague memories of the occupation and, as well as like the time period when Japan was being used as basically a giant military depot by the United States during the Korean War. These younger Japanese people had never really experienced any of this. So their identity is going to be very different from those of their parents. This was probably true also of Shintaro Tsuji's only child, a son named Kunihiko, who was born in the early 50s. Kunihiko would be basically raised alongside Sanrio, groomed to take over the company someday, which is very, very common in Japanese company is still common today. The eldest son sort of takes over the company. And so he must have been watching the evolution of the Yamanashi Silk Center. He would have been about 17 years old at the close of the 1960s. And so his mind too was probably already imagining what the company could become. Oh, one thing I want to note, it was quite difficult to find some of the early details about Shintaro Tsuji's life and the Yamanashi Silk Center. Shintaro Tsuji did write an autobiography in the year 2000, Kore ga Sanrio no Himitsu, which I think means this is Sanrio's secret, but it's only in Japanese, a language that I have extremely little skill in. So yeah, that book wasn't very accessible to me. There was also another book often referenced, like on Wikipedia and places like that, which is called Hello Kitty, The Remarkable Story of Sanrio and the $1 Billion Feline Phenomenon. And that was by journalists Ken Belson and Brian Bremner. And that one came out, I think, at the end of 2003. Unfortunately, that book is out of print and very difficult to get unless you have like nearly $200 lying around. Luckily, there are two books that, while not focusing specifically on Sanrio, they have a wealth of information. The first one was, and I think I've referenced both of them now, but it's Pink Globalization, Hello Kitty's Trek Across the Pacific by Christine Arellano. And the other one, Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World, and that's by Matt Alt. I heartily recommend both of these books. They are well researched, and their indexes and bibliographies and note sections alone are worth their price. So between Yano's book and Matt Alt's book and archived interviews with Tsuji, along with YouTube videos featuring Belson or Yano or Matt Alt, I was... and I also just trolled through available Wikipedia citations. I was able to get a decent picture of what Tsuji's early life was like. I also searched for as many of the messages from the Strawberry King articles as possible on the Japanese Sanrio site. As I mentioned before, in August of every year, Tsuji reflects on his war experiences and publishes them under his nickname, the Strawberry King, in the Sanrio monthly magazine/newspaper, which I will talk about more in the next episode. So here we are. We've followed the wealthy but alienated orphan from his childhood and war experiences into his qualification as a chemist, through his bureaucratic career, and into the beginnings of the effervescent, outward-looking businessman that people know and love today. I think his instinct to partner with popular and upcoming artists and writers of the time will prove to be a good one. Of course it will. It will actually prove itself again and again as the decades roll on. It's been fascinating to me to know more about what was happening in Japan culturally during the first half of the 20th century, especially Japan's design sense and how things were affected by the war and the occupation afterward. It's amazing to think that, Tsuji was coming through all of that with such a clear sense of wanting to continue trying all the things. He was completely throwing himself into his business, using every experience along the way as a lesson for the future. And all of these experiences, the childhood, war, the beginnings of the quiet aesthetic, these will drive his decisions, which will ultimately catapult Sanrio into true domestic and international fame and success. So there you go. The beginnings, we've now covered the beginnings. The foundation has been laid. My drinks are done. The high up Hello Kitty soda is long gone. Ramune is nearly gone. You can hear the marble on the inside. Oh my gosh, that's probably pretty loud for you guys. Sorry. Yeah, I have plenty of snacks left, but I'm sure my son will raid those when he gets home from school. And yeah, I can't wait to find out more and eat more snacks in the next episode, which you need to stay tuned because in that episode, we're going to dive into the 1970s. And let me just say, the company of Sanrio in the 70s is wild. I mean, not only will we be meeting the girls, Hello Kitty and My Melody, but the amount of projects that Sanrio branches into, I mean, the amount of things that they try, it's truly incredible. 僕はゾウ使いのバルゾウの名前はジャンボ僕らはジャンボとバルジャンボとバルお辞儀をするんだジャンボジャンボ逆立ちするんだジャンボ Yep, so lots and lots to cover. So come back next month. Once again, I'm Jess, writer, host, and crazy trinket auntie, and this has been the Trinket Picnic Podcast. Thanks for listening, my fine friends, and see you next time. Bye!
Everybody say Hello Kitty. Who loves flowers in the sun or a party just for